Well, thank you, Patricia, and also Barbara for welcoming me to Kansas. And I'm sure at some point in the future, our paths will cross again. This long-term engagement that I've encountered with printmaking does go all the way back to my dissertation, where I was actually looking at the history of lithography in Mexico City. And so this is a continuation of that thinking. The overarching themes that guided my investigation of the history of prints were time, place, and community. And we'll see that these kinds of communities developed among printmakers across the nation and across the world. The printmaking renaissance that occurred in the United States in the 1920s and spanned through the end of World War II included a blossoming of techniques, approaches, workshops, and academic programs built on the understanding that prints could be original works of fine art rather than forms of reproduction. This fertile time for printmaking set the stage for a vibrant, creative approach to making images that continues today. Different techniques from lithography to etching to relief printing became cornerstones, but artists also explored new techniques and approaches to making prints. I'll provide a short introduction on how woodblock prints are made, and then I will shift my focus to some of the ways in which woodblock printmakers are connected through artistic communities that they cultivated in the earlier part of the 20th century, some of which continued for decades. And as a fair warning, most of the prints that I'll be talking about today are color prints, but not all of them are. So you'll see a variety of approaches to making woodblock prints as well. And I'm only going to talk briefly about the influence of Japanese printmaking and also the European traditions, because I know that later Barbara is going to really delve more deeply into that history. So you'll see that I reference it, but please be patient and know that you're going to get a much fuller description of how those movements occurred and played out over time, both in Japan and Europe. The woodblock print is an age-old approach to making images. It began with the Chinese around 868 CE. While we don't have the time to discuss the entire history of woodblock prints here, I would like to point to a few examples that have had a major impact on modern and contemporary artists. The Edo period in Japan and European traditions from the early 20th century were extremely influential. Hakusai's Snowy Morning in Koshikawa, shown here, is an example of the Japanese key block method. You can see the black outline throughout the print, and I'm just sort of showing you here with my mouse cursor, where this outline appears readily within the print. That outline actually becomes an important part of how the color block print is made. For the Japanese, in using this key block method, it was not just a single artist who was working on this particular kind of print. There was actually an entire team of carvers and inkers and printers, and became a much more of a team effort than necessarily the artist being the only person working on this particular project. Of course, the artist was actually recognized for the idea. So in this case, you get a sense of what a Japanese traditional woodblock would look like. But what's interesting about this particular print is that you see that everyday events are actually being depicted in the print. Also, you see that there's a very different perspective of how we expect to see the iconic Mount Fuji represented. Instead of this larger than life physical feature, it becomes somewhat of the background within the image. And the people get pulled more into the foreground, which is sort of the opposite of what you expect from a landscape. In this example, even though we get a sense of what the traditional methods are, we still see how artists are constantly playing with and pushing not only their techniques and materials, but also the visual languages that they create and produce within their prints. Another tradition that profoundly impacted modern and contemporary woodblock printmakers were the expressionist works coming out of Europe in the early 20th century. Feininger's Steeple and Sun is just one example of the exploration of line and form that was more characteristic of this European model. And as I said earlier, I'm going to include black and white prints so that you can see the distinctions between color woodblock printmaking and the ways in which other printmakers were engaging with the matrix and the materials without necessarily looking to color. In Feininger's case, he wanted to capture the simplest forms possible without the consideration of color. He was a key figure at the Bauhaus, the famous German art school where the idea of arts and the crafts movement really took hold. That movement also had a significant impact on printmakers, both visually and in that it created the expectation that the artist should complete their own prints from start to finish. Prints became a way to democratize art in the sense that it should be affordable and available to everyone. So this next series of images that I'm going to show you are actually a way to demonstrate, to explain how a woodblock color print is made. So Gustav Bowman is one of the most important color woodblock printmakers to come from New Mexico. And I'll talk a little bit more about his history later, but I'm using an example of a famous print that he actually did before he came to New Mexico. It has sometimes it's titled differently, but when I refer to it, I refer to it as the Hoosier Garden. So this was his grandmother's garden in Indiana. And so what you see here is an example of the matrix, the wood block that Bowman carved into to basically create the print that he was going to create in the end. And I'll just show you the finished product before I launch into how he did this. So this is what he ended up with from his block. So as I said earlier, there are varying techniques and materials, but generally to create a woodcut, it involves carving the plank side of a wooden block with the grain running lengthwise. When the image is basically when the material is cut away, the area that is going to be printed is left. This is what basically the definition of a relief print is. After the block is carved, then it's inked and the image is transferred to paper, either by hand or rubbing it with a press. The type of wood used significantly impacts the final image. The harder the wood and the finer the grain, then the easier it is for the artist to carve more intricate and detailed compositions. The softer the wood, the more the grain is visible and its character and texture become part of the finished print. The tools used to make woodcuts have remained relatively simple. A knife is used to cut the block and gouges are used to clear the wood between the areas that will eventually produce the image. If the artist wants to produce a black line, both sides of the line have to be carved away separately. If a simple cut is made, lines appear white rather than black. In other words, the areas left raised are the shapes that make up the image rather than the lines that define its boundaries. And so here you get a sense of the key block. For Bowman, he did use a press. And you can see also here in this print, along the side, these 4 holes that actually served as his registration system. And so it's really important to make sure that each block is the same size and also that you have some kind of a system set up so that they line up perfectly when the different color blocks are then printed. And each color requires a different block. Stark contrast of light and dark and strong outlines are often considered the visual language of woodblock printmaking. Some artists, however, create tonal variation by burnishing the outer edges of the line, where the edge of the line is angled rather than flat. Less ink adheres to those areas, producing a lighter tone. Artists also create tonal variation by carving out groupings of lines and varying the thickness, direction, and spacing of those lines. Other artists forgo line altogether and conceive of their composition entirely in masses of color. The type and quality of paper, ink, and rollers, as well as the printing method, also determine the outcome of the final print. The use of a press, for example, transfers the ink to the paper with a more uniform amount of pressure, influencing how dark or light the impression will be throughout. And I haven't really talked about other matrices that are also used in relief printmaking. Today, we're primarily looking at woodblock prints, but woodblock prints encompass a whole variety of approaches, including linoleum block prints, and other types of materials that artists have carved into to then create images that are transferred to paper for the print. A couple of technical elements that I'll just point out since we're on this particular Gustav Bowman print. You'll see that in the bottom of the print here, looks like it's an orange heart with the hand carved into it. That's actually Gustav Bowman's chop. And a chop is considered in the printmaking world, it's essentially part of the artist's signature. So every one of his prints includes one of these chops. He also often would create these kinds of borders that you see framing the print here. Bowman didn't do that always, but it was pretty common in many of the works that he created. In the United States, artists like Frank Morley Fletcher and Arthur Wesley Dow explored both the Japanese and European traditions. Here we see Dow grappling with line and color as he recreates scenes of a bridge in Massachusetts. He wrote a handbook on the Japanese method and also was a major proponent in the arts and education circles that developed around the arts and crafts movement. And he really wanted to advance the ideas that it was important for the artists to be involved in each aspect of creating their prints. Here, he's also challenging the boundaries of line and color, but at the same time, maintaining the sense of notan, which is the Japanese word for balance. For him, that was the most valuable lesson to be derived from the Japanese tradition. The movement of ideas had a major impact on how artists approached their work. These printmakers were looking both to tradition and ways to challenge that tradition. In my exploration of this medium, I have found that this is one of the key elements to understanding block prints. That is, always with an eye toward the historical development of the medium, but also a keen knowledge of how artists are grappling with that history, as well as techniques and themes that are relevant in their own time and place. It was this exploration of ideas that led to the formation of creative communities. And that really is going to be one of the most important elements of the rest of my talk, is talking about the connections between these artists, how they were educated and came across each other's work in similar communities, whether it was in New York at the Art Students League or in Kansas through the Prairie Print Makers. You'll see that there are these incredible communities around printmaking that developed back then, and also printmakers today have developed their own communities. We just completed an exhibition that was called The Printer's Proof, Artist and Printer Collaborations, and we explored how today's printmaking communities continue to strive to be strong and vibrant artistic communities that support each other, and also figure out ways to make the sale of prints as well as the exhibition of prints readily available to audiences across the United States and the world. And so it's that idea of community that I really want to focus on as we move forward in this exhibition, in this presentation. So one of the most, as I mentioned, one of the most noted of all the woodblock artists is, of course, Gustav Bowman. He was a figure in northern New Mexican art movements, including the New Mexico painters who promoted a modern approach to making art. But again, it's important to have an eye to the past and awareness of the time in which the print was made. In order to explore the beauty and the intricacy of Bowman's prints, you have to have a sense of understanding that he was very much embedded in his community of New Mexico, as much as he was also a transplant here. He was clearly a proponent of the classic Japanese key block method, but he at the same time did every aspect of that method himself. So he carved a different block for each color in the print. Typically, he would carve from 9 to 11 blocks for each of the works that he created. However, he was insistent that inking the block, printing his own works, and making sure that the different systems that he used were specific to his own craft and his own creativity. In Spring Blossoms, which you see here, the silver leaf that delineates the sky from the ground is an example of Bowman's experimental practices. He was actually one of the first artists in the United States to incorporate metal leaf into his prints. He was also known to go back and rework blocks and experiment with colors. So you might see several versions of this Spring Blossoms print that look quite different, because he would go back and rework those blocks and reuse them. Printmaking societies became more important forms of supporting artists. A few examples are the California Society of Etchers in 1912, the LA group called Print Makers of California in 1914, the Brooklyn Society of Etchers in 1950. And as it was mentioned earlier, C.A. Seward launched the Prairie Print Makers Society in 1930 in Kansas. These societies were dedicated to promoting the graphic arts through exhibitions and education. They also became important networks in which printmakers exchanged ideas and techniques. In his essay, American Block Prints, Seward emphasized that American woodblock printmakers tended to undertake the entire process themselves, rather than working with a team of carvers and printers. Along with other artists such as Dow, Seward made the case that hands-on approaches played an important role in allowing for individual expression in technique, design, and execution. He also highlighted the importance of the development of art education as a vehicle both for appreciating and creating works of art and craft. One of the common activities offered in art education programs was some form of block printmaking. And even this brief exposure to the medium spurred the curiosity of many future artists. According to Seward, the modern woodcut is no longer an imitation of Dürer's or a feeble parody of the Japanese color print, but a strong, stalwart, healthy child born of the creative spirit of the modern American artist, and quite capable of saying some convincing things to those who love things beautiful, both visually and spiritually, seems quite indispensable. And so Seward, through the process of creating the society, also made friends and connections and incredibly long-lasting networks in different parts of the United States, but especially here in New Mexico. And you'll see that there are very different approaches that these printmakers brought to these communities, to these societies, but they all still supported each other in big and interesting ways. Another key element that I think was part of the connection between the communities in New Mexico and the community they developed in Kansas was also this idea of the West and the ways in which they interacted with the Southwestern landscape in particular. So in this example, Big Pine's Raton Pass, which was one of Seward's block prints that depicted the Southwestern landscape, you can see here how he captures the iconic clouds that are pretty typical of New Mexico landscapes. He also uses primarily contour line and not necessarily color to create a sense of movement and volume and juxtaposition of light and dark with just line. The sky behind the clouds and the hills is made up of many cuts going in different directions. The texture of the block, along with the closely carved lines, creates the backdrop that gives the cloud volume and lends the appearance of movement to the water. And you can see here that in the land in the foreground, it also creates a sense of the variation of the landscape. Seward's prints were widely exhibited and recognized in exhibitions in the United States and around the world. Perhaps, though, it was his role as the founder of the Prairie Print Makers and his dedication to promoting printmaking as a fine art that had a major impact on printmaking, not only here in New Mexico, but also across the United States. In 1894, at the age of 23, after a stint in Paris, Birger Sandzén made his way to the United States, and he settled in Lindsborg, Kansas, where he was invited to become a language professor and later a professor at Bethany College. It was there that he met Seward and became a lifelong friend and promoter of Sandzén's work. In that first decade in Kansas, Sandzén's palette began to change, which he directly attributed to the atmosphere and geography of the West. In 1908, he made his first of many trips to Colorado, and beginning in 1915, he became a regular visitor to Santa Fe and Taos, later becoming a member of the Taos Society of Artists. He was interested in dramatic land formations, but also the qualities of color and light that he felt was a result of the arid climate. He described the prairies, mountains, and deserts as major influences on his art. Oscar Berninghaus, Sven Sandzén, and Gustav Bowman were three of the important woodblock printmakers who captured the landscapes in the medium of woodblock. They all arrived in Taos and Santa Fe at different times during the first decades of the 20th century, and became members of the burgeoning artist colonies that were established in the then remote northern towns. Berninghaus first visited Taos in 1899. He joined Joseph Henry Sharp, Birger Phillips, and Ernest Blumenschein. They were among the original founders of the Taos Society of Artists in 1912. Later, they were joined by Kaus, Dunton, Higgins, and Walter Ufer. In this print entitled Early Taos, Berninghaus evokes the rural qualities of that part of northern New Mexico that he first encountered. The burros carrying wood and the covered wagon harken back to a time of simplicity and rugged living conditions. According to Berninghaus, there were vistas of mountains and plains that permitted almost any sort of indulgence in landscape sketching. And you can see here that he does incorporate some color into this print, and it's a very subtle in the sky and in the mountains, and you can even see it in the steeple of the church, how he's incorporating, and that also the vibrant light that many artists will talk about when they visit and represent different landscapes in New Mexico. Along with Bowman, Andrew Dosberg was part of the group of artists in northern New Mexico that incorporated a modernist approach to art. This means that they were exploring aesthetic solutions that were not necessarily naturalistic, and they were looking to new and different media and techniques. Many of these artists were primarily painters, except for Bowman, of course, but they also embraced the possibilities that various mediums, including the woodblock, presented. Dosberg came to New Mexico as a guest of Mabel Dodge Lujan. This is one of the few woodblock prints that he did of her home in Taos. He was clearly not interested in capturing the naturalistic view of the adobe. The forms are reduced to simple shapes and areas of black and white, but the composition is anything but simple. The building simultaneously appears to recede into space in some areas and is completely flat in other areas. We're also unsure of the perspective of the image. Notice how we appear to be looking down on the porch, but looking up at other parts of the building. Dosberg studied at the Art Students League of New York. He also studied in Europe and was part of the famous 1913 Armory Show in New York. There's a really famous Clinton Adams quote that talks about how we often want to create a simple, linear, art historical narrative that allows the ideas of modernism to essentially play out in a very structured way. But as you can see here, even among the woodblock printmakers who were creating these works in the earlier half of the 20th century, there are very different approaches to modernism that are being explored all the time. And there are incredible overlaps in the different artistic movements, whether they were utilizing forms of expressionism, whether they were engaging with different elements of cubism. Modernism takes on this entirely messy, but also very interesting a way of creating artwork and challenging the way in which art had historically been made throughout history. Another important artist that was very prolific in New Mexico was Howard Cook. Cook studied with Dosberg at the Art Students League in New York. He came to New Mexico in the 20s and settled here permanently in the 1930s. In Pueblo Moonlight, the print that you see here, he imbues a form of architecture that is often seen as dense and geometrically static with energy and tension. He does this all through the very detailed and intentional rendering of his lines, which are carved in different directions and deliberately grouped. The sometimes subtle and sometimes stark juxtaposition of light and dark also adds to the drama of the building. Notice how he uses these deep, deep sections of black that then really highlight certain areas of light that really jump right off of the print. Howard Cook's work is something that I have to say he's one of the printers who I've seen who had very few missteps in the prints that created over his lifetime. Here's a more intimate example of a scene that he captured with his dog. And here he demonstrates further how masterful he was at carving a matrix with such fine precision. He wasn't necessarily interested in capturing this naturalistic, image of his dog, but he wanted to show this relationship between himself and his pet. And from a very different perspective, you can see that his shoes are actually in the print, with his pet. He also created some figures like this, which is Tony Lujan, which captured not only the landscape and the everyday scenes around him, but also the people and cultures of New Mexico. Another artist who was also interested in capturing the cultural aspects of New Mexico was a painter, printmaker, and children's book illustrator named Barbara Latham. She was born in Massachusetts and studied at the Pratt Institute in New York. She also worked with Dosberg at the Art Students League summer school in Woodstock. She spent most of the early part of her career in New York City, where she worked for a publishing company designing Christmas cards and other ephemera. She also did illustrations for Forum magazine and the New York Times Sunday magazine. And I mention all of this because many of the artists that were creating works at this time also had to make a living. And printmaking was just one of the ways in which they found the opportunity to make sales of their works that supported other aspects of their ability to create artworks. She was married to Howard Cook, and they traveled widely in Mexico and Paris, but it was in Taos where they really settled and found inspiration for their work. According to Latham, I had lived under the brilliant western sky all summer, but I had never experienced such brilliance contrasted with such fragrant desert. I loved Taos from the moment I stepped off the train. All that subject matter of the villages, both the Spanish and the Indian, lend themselves to my style. And so you get a real sense of the connection that many of the artists coming to New Mexico had with the land and also to each other. Barbara also had an interesting sense of humor. She loved to bring a humorous side of what she was creating as well. What's fascinating about Barbara's prints, though, is that she always had this attention to detail that was embedded in the wood block itself. But fascinatingly, she also did linoleum block prints that she would then work to make it look as if there was a wood texture in the print. So you can see that in this linoleum block, the wood that you see in the image was actually carved to look like wood. It wasn't actually the texture of the block itself. And you can see that in some prints, that's the case, and in others, she carves it to have a different texture. Barbara is actually the first woman artist that I've mentioned so far in this presentation. And there were actually quite a few women woodblock printmakers that were active during this time period, including Dorothy Newkirk Stewart, who arrived in Santa Fe in the mid-20s and focused nearly all of her work on American Indian life. She studied painting at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and at the American School of Fine Arts in Fontainebleau, France. She also spent a significant amount of time in Mexico. Her Santa Fe home, which she named Galeria Mexicana, became a hive of cultural activity. She was also known for championing Indian communities and supporting Native American arts and crafts. She was honored by the Association on Indian Affairs for her work with Indigenous communities. And I had the happy opportunity to actually discover that the Albuquerque Museum has several portfolios of Dorothy Newkirk Stewart's work. And before we did the project that was the carved line, they had been stored in the museum's collections, but really hadn't been documented or researched. So this was an amazing set of objects that we were able to discover in our own collections. And notice how she uses also white line in her compositions to create the energy and the sense of movement that you see here. There's a real expressiveness in the figures that she has created, but also look at the horses as they come around the grain, and you can see how they're simultaneously connected to each other, but also individual figures within the print. And it was that kind of energy and movement that you saw across the many, many prints that she did, capturing the places and the cultures of the Southwest and Mexico. Norma Bassett Hall was from Oregon, but she studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she met her husband, William. They traveled throughout the United States and Europe. And she was attracted to the Japanese woodblock printmaking method. She liked the idea of using multiple blocks for different colors. She also loved to use transparent inks that she worked exclusively in the woodblock medium to create this incredible layering of color and light, and also a sense of perspective that's true to the way that we think about landscape and when we think about traditional landscapes. And so she really honed in on that idea of creating a perspective that pulls us into the image and makes us feel as if we are part of the landscape that she's presenting in her images. The Halls actually lived in Kansas for several years, and both were charter members of the Prairie Print Makers. In 1943, one of Norma's prints was actually selected as the annual print to be distributed to the associate members of the Printmaking Society. She was the only woman member of that group and the only one to establish a reputation exclusively in this medium. In 1944, Norma and William actually moved to Santa Fe, where she began to continue to make prints. And you can see here that this is actually one of the images of a Southwestern landscape that she also created. In addition to that, they ran an art school and established studios for the exhibition and display of prints as well. Another woman artist that I wanted to share with you is Gussy Desjardins. She didn't really have much of a connection to Kansas, but in New Mexico, she became one of the prolific printmakers. And one of the reasons I wanted to show you this particular print was because here you can see the actual wood grain as she incorporated it into the print to create the water that you see in the foreground. And of course, the lines that seem simple that she carves into the matrix create this beautifully serene and peaceful examination of a kind of an intimate, naturalistic part of nature that she was exploring at that time. T.C. Cannon was one of the, if not the most profound, important Native American artists. He was actually born in Oklahoma and raised in Kiowa. And he studied at the Institute of American Indian Arts in 1964, just 2 years after the school was established. It was the first to focus on Indian education in the United States and to make art a central focus of the curriculum. He was exposed to other innovative artists and teachers such as Fritz Scholder, and he was in an environment where Native American traditions were allowed rather than prohibited. Unlike many Indian schools preceding the IAIA, by 1970, T.C. Cannon already had a profound response to the criticisms lodged against the artists coming out of his school. And in a statement for a one-man show, he said, "Contemporary Indian art is an ever-expanding field full of infinite directions and countless rewards and dreams. In these few works, I've tried to align myself along the lines and codes of my ethnic background. I've not shut out my tradition, nor have I attempted to sacrifice or negate the rational idiom from where I started. Though my work stems from and entails Indian themes, it may be questionable if I had to do the traditional type works that are usually demanded of an Indian artist. I lean toward a more abstract idiom, which I feel suits my situation more ideally. The contemporary Indian of today is a much more open-minded individual than 10 years ago, especially the young people with their sensitive, revealing outlooks on the present day world. They will and are changing the world of art." And I think it's that sentiment that continues to influence and impact artists of all media that are developing in the United States in different ways. And, you know, just to speak to the diversity of the way that T.C. Cannon worked, you can see here a comparison of two different ways that he approached printmaking. In the print on the right, which says Dene, you can see that he carved the block himself. It was meant to be a rough carve that incorporated the structure and the texture of the block. But in the other print, in the color print that you see here, he actually traveled to Japan to work with two of the most important woodblock printmakers to create this. So you can actually see traditional Japanese woodblock printmaking techniques that are compared to something that he had done on his own. And you see the different chops that recognize the various collaborators that he worked with. You can see the key, the color block key, that's also traditional, often in some of the projects that were developed with Japanese artisans and craftsmen and artists. And you can also see, interestingly, that T.C. Cannon signed the print, but also there's a signature from his father. And in this particular image, the female figure that is being featured is actually his grandmother. And so his father is gestating in her body at that particular point. And so he felt it was appropriate to go ahead and have his father also sign the print. But here you get a sense of the landscape in the background, but also the power of this incredible woman who takes center stage in this particular woodblock print. So I think we are at about 1:23. I'm going to go ahead and stop here and take any questions that you all have. By way of conclusion, though, I will say that you've seen a very small sampling of woodblock artists that had a connection to communities that were connected through place and through time, and who were also connected to both, many of them, not all of them, to Kansas and also to New Mexico. So I hope this gives you a very focused view on some of the ways that these artists developed. And I know that Barbara is going to expand and give a much broader view of the way that we think about woodblock printmaking and how it connects to the arts and crafts movement, as well as to traditional Japanese woodblock printmaking.
Very, very helpful, giving both sort of a broad view, but helping us to understand some things about the media and get to know a couple of the key artists. So I'm first going to ask the audience here to join me in applause for such a wonderful talk.